A few days ago, I did a video where I really touted Xmonad as being one of the best tiling window managers out there because of how minimal and suckless it is, but also how powerful, how flexible and customizable Xmonad is. And many of you guys are trying out Xmonad because of my videos in the past, and some of you guys are having some issues and are wanting help. You guys are asking for a video tutorial on how to get started with Xmonad, and I've done similar videos in the past on other tiling window managers. I did a getting started with Awesome Window Manager video a couple of months back, and that was very popular. A lot of you guys seem to think that was helpful, getting started with Awesome Window Manager, and I did a series of videos on getting started with the Qtile Window Manager. So today we're going to give Xmonad the same treatment. I'm going to install Xmonad in a VM. I'm going to install it on Ubuntu 2004 and show you the basics of getting started and configuring Xmonad from the very beginning. So let me switch over to the desktop, and I'm using Ubuntu 2004 as an example today to do this install of Xmonad, is because I know most desktop Linux users are probably running Ubuntu or an Ubuntu-based system, so I'm using that today. But those of you that are on an Arch-based system like me, it's all going to be the same thing, except instead of installing software with apt, you'll use Pacman. Same thing with Fedora is going to use DNF, SUSE is going to use Zipper, etc. But other than just installing the Xmonad package, everything else we do should be the same. So in Ubuntu, of course, we're going to use the apt package manager, and we need to install a few things. The first thing you want to do is sudo apt install Xmonad. That's the base Xmonad package. That's the window manager. Now, to make Xmonad extensible, you really need a second package as well called Xmonad-contrib. These are the extra libraries and the extra modules that really allow you to extend Xmonad and add a bunch of extra functionality. Think of DWM and its patching system, how you have to go out and get each and every patch that you want to, add to DWM. Well, you don't have to do that with something like Xmonad. All these extra modules and extra libraries that the community has contributed to are all in this extra package called Xmonad-contrib. And let's just install these two for now. So if I hit enter, Xmonad-contrib is not available, so it must be named something different in Ubuntu. On Arch-based systems, it will be Xmonad and Xmonad-contrib, but let's see what it is on Ubuntu. So let's do an apt search Xmonad-contrib, and let's see. There is a Xmonad-contrib dev right here, extensions to Xmonad. Actually, it's a very long name, libghc Xmonad-contrib-dev. All right. I'm hoping that's the right package. Let's go ahead and sudo apt install Xmonad space and then libghc-xmonad-contrib-dev. Damn, that's a long name. That's a horrible name for that package. All right, there's two other things you really need to install before getting started with Xmonad. And I promise you, most new Xmonad users really get frustrated in the beginning because they didn't install these two programs that I'm about to tell you to install before ever getting started. Xterm and dmenu. And then I'm going to hit yes, and it's going to install a ton of packages. It's going to install 76 newly installed packages here on the system. And you're going to say, well, we only installed 4 programs. Well, it's the dependencies. And mainly, it's the dependencies for Xmonad itself, which has to have the Haskell programming language installed on the system and the Haskell compiler, GHC, installed on the system. All right, and those 4 packages finished installing. It took just a couple of minutes there. And then what we need to do is log out of our current session here. So we are, of course, logged into GNOME here. What we want to do is go back to our login manager. And then let me move my head out of the way so you can see this. I'm going to click the username, and then I'm going to go down to the cogwheel here. And instead of just having the GNOME session that we were logged into, and then, of course, the GNOME session on Wayland, we also now have an Xmonad session. So I'm going to type in my password, and then I'm going to hit enter. And this is Xmonad out of the box. This is what I was warning you about when you first log into Xmonad for the very first time. It is simply a black screen. There's no wallpaper, no menus. You can click and right click. Nothing happens. You do have a cursor. So the first thing you need to know before ever getting started is you need to know the default key bindings in Xmonad. Now, we're going to change these as we create our own config file, but hard-coded, The binding to open a terminal is mod shift enter, and the mod key is hard-coded as Alt until we change it later. We may change it to the super key later, but Alt shift enter will bring us a terminal. And it does bring up the GNOME terminal, so it does recognize that the GNOME terminal is the default terminal emulator that was set on this Ubuntu distribution, so that's good. But the reason I made you guys install Xterm is just in case you don't have a default terminal emulator set up on your system. You need one, and the one that Xmonad is going to expect you to have is Xterm. Also, I made you install dmenu Alt-P. Has dmenu, so that is the way you get dmenu. And I'm going to launch Firefox because we need a web browser here because there's something very important that we need. I'm actually going to highlight the terminal window. I actually don't need it right now, so Alt-Shift-C will close the terminal. So we need to write our own Xmonad config. There's not an example one on the system, I don't think. At least I've never found one in the past when I've done this. Of course, I've had my own Xmonad config for years, so I've never actually had to look for the default config. But I do know they have an example config file on the Xmonad website. And I believe if I search for Xmonad config archive, yeah, this page right here, the Xmonad config archive at the Haskell wiki. This site has some example configs, but the one that we really want is this one right here. It says download the latest darks template xmonad.hs, and that will give us what we need. So if I save the file, I guess it's going to save it to our downloads folder. So Alt-Shift-C to close Firefox, Alt-Shift-Enter to open our terminal again. And let me zoom in this terminal. Let's see, I'm not exactly sure how to zoom in on the GNOME terminal, but luckily the menu is still there. If I cd into downloads here and do an ls, you will see we have xmonad.hs. HS is the extension for Haskell. It doesn't need to be in our downloads directory, so let's move it. So mv for move xmonad.hs, and we need to move it into our home directory. And in our home directory, there should be a directory called .xmonad. It was already created. That directory gets created when you install Xmonad, but it doesn't place a xmonad.hs in that directory. You actually have to take the trouble to make that file and write it yourself. So let's go ahead and write the full path here. All right, now if I cd back into the home directory and cd into .xmonad and do an ls, xmonad.hs is there. If I wanted to, I could open this in Vim or Nano or whatever text editor you want to take a look at it in. Gedit is installed here in Ubuntu. We could have used the graphical text editor if you had preferred. So some first things you need to know. You see the comments here at the top of the page. Now to make a comment in Haskell, you do 2 dashes. 2 dashes is a comment. The next section you see is you're importing various modules here, various libraries, and these are important because later you're going to basically call upon these if you're going to use them later in your Xmonad config. You know what, to clean this up a little bit, what I would suggest doing, and you guys don't have to do this, but I'm going to delete most of these comments and, start making this config your own. So the first thing I would do is I would start making notes of what each thing does here in this config file. So I'm making a note here that this section here is the imports. The next thing you probably want to do is you want to change this variable here that says my terminal. It is set to Xterm. What this does is by setting this variable, anytime in this document that we type my terminal, it automatically becomes the word Xterm. So when you're setting all these key bindings that involve your terminal, if you ever change terminal emulators from Xterm, say to URXVT down the road, you don't have to come back and change like 100 different lines in this config file. By setting this variable, this is the only thing you need to change. If you ever change terminal emulators, you just need to change Xterm to URXVT or to ST or Alacrity or whatever terminal emulator you want to use. I'm going to leave it as Xterm because I know Xterm is on the system. If we scroll down here, some other variables that are set are my border width equals 1. That's the border around the windows. You can see the border of the window with focus is a red color, a bright red color. I'm fine with that for now. The bright red stands out. And 1 pixels, you know what? If I really wanted to, I'd probably make that a little bit wider for my personal preference, I'd rather that be 2. So let's go ahead and change that to 2. The next thing I definitely want to change is I definitely want to change my mod mask equals mod1 mask. What is this? This is setting the mod key. By default, the mod key in Xmonad is set to Alt, but most people are probably going to want to set that to mod for mask. So now that we have the mod key set to super, you know what, I'm going to go ahead and do :W here in Vim for a write, and let's go ahead and restart Xmonad so the super key now becomes my mod key. So if I do Alt Q, because Alt is still the mod key right now, Alt Q restarts Xmonad. That's the default binding for that. Alright, we just restarted Xmonad. Now super shift enter. Yeah, brings up Xterm. Super shift C closes. Okay, so we now have the super key working for us as the mod key. The next thing you want to check out here in the config is the workspaces. You see my workspaces 1 through 9. That's the name and the title of the workspaces. That's what they would appear as far as the names of the workspaces if you had a panel. We don't have a panel yet. We should get one. We'll talk about that in just a second. Well, let's keep on with the config. Here is the color. So the border colors, normal border is this color here, DDDDD. That is a light gray color. And then my focus border color is FF0000. That is the bright red color around the window with focus. Let me open up a second window, and you see the window with focus has a red border, and the window that doesn't have focus has a gray border. By the way, now that I have these two windows open, I believe Super J and K, because we changed the mod key to Super J and K, will shift focus between these two windows. Super Shift C, of course, closes. The next section you come to is the key bindings. The key bindings are pretty self-explanatory how this works. You set the key binding to mod plus whatever combination of keys, and then the command that you want these key bindings to run. For example, you set the mod key plus P on the keyboard, mod P, in my case, super P, spawns, that's the command it runs, it's a Xmonad spawn. What does it spawn? It spawns dmenu_run, that's the name of the program. So if I do super P, you see dmenu runs at the top of the screen. Let me escape to get out of dmenu. That's kind of the way all the key bindings work. You got mod key plus 1 or 2 other keys, and then the name of the command. And that's it. It's pretty self-explanatory setting the key bindings. You guys shouldn't have much problems with that. You do have mouse bindings. I would just leave these as the default. There's no reason to play with this because there is mouse functionality actually in most tiling window managers, pretty much all tiling window managers I've ever used. And what you do is if I grabbed the window with super and the left mouse button, I could drag this window. Now it's not going to work because I'm actually going to drag the entire VM because, you know, it's just the way it is because my host machine is going to recognize that. But that's how that works. If I did super and the right mouse button, you know, I resize super and the left, you know, drags the window. That's kind of how that works. But you see the host machine. I'm actually running Xmonad on the host machine and Xmonad in Ubuntu here in the VM. Let me see if I can force that back into the tiling mode. Yes, I can. The next section is the layout section. By default, it looks like you have 3 layouts: tiled, mirror tiled, and full. So if I do super shift enter to get another terminal, super shift enter to get yet another terminal, I'll launch htop or just do a ls to have something different on one of the terminals. So the default layout is what we call the master and stack layout, which it looks like is the tiled layout. That's what it's named here, at least in this config file. If I keep opening stuff, you can see it's the master and stack. Let me close those last couple of windows. Now the other layouts that are available were mirrored tile and full screen. I believe to get to those, super and tab changes the layouts. No, super tab changes focus. Super shift tab maybe changes the layout. I'm going to have to look up the default key binding, either that or I need to scroll back up and find the key bindings that does this here in the config. It's actually mod space, so in my case super space changes the layout. Okay, this is the mirrored tiled layout, and super space changes to the full layout. So tiled, mirror tiled, and full. So super space gets us back to the default tiled layout. Let me super shift C to close those 2 terminal windows. And let's scroll down further in the config. The next section is window rules. This is where you set rules for various programs. For example, there are some windows you always want to be floating. For example, in this section, it looks like mPlayer and GIMP are both set to always float. And that's kind of what you want to do with a lot of things. A lot of things you don't want to be in a tiling layout, notifications and things like that. You know, you don't want them to be forced in a tiling layout. You just want them to be floated on the screen. Going further down the config, the most important thing is probably this right here, the startup hook. So this performs an arbitrary action each time Xmonad starts or is restarted. So this is basically your programs that are going to start every time Xmonad launches. So I can tell you two things you definitely want to always start in every time you launch Xmonad or any tiling window manager. You're going to probably want something to draw a wallpaper on the screen, and you're going to want transparency. You're going to want a compositor. So you need to install either Compton or PyCom, depending on your distro. I think it's still called Compton in the Ubuntu repositories. On Arch and Arch-based systems, you need to install PyCom as a compositor. So what we're going to do is going to go to this line that says my startup hook equals, and I'm actually going to delete the return and the parentheses here, and I'm going to type the word do. I'm going to hit enter. I'm going to space over just to have some indentation so it's obvious what I'm doing here. I'm going to do spawn once. And then I'm going to do quotes, and I'm going to do nitrogen space dash dash restore space and then an ampersand. I'm going to tell Xmonad, hey, as soon as you launch, I want you to run nitrogen space dash dash restore. And that is going to set our wallpaper, assuming nitrogen is installed on our system. We haven't installed it yet, so I'll install it in just a second. But I'm going to hit enter, and I'm going to go down here, and I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to do spawn once, quote, and we're going to launch not PyCom because I don't think it exists in Ubuntu. I think it's still called Compton, space, ampersand, and then the ending quotes. You know what? I'm going to just leave it as that for now. Let me do a :W for write here in Vim. Then I'm going to do a super shift enter to get Xterm here. And let's do a sudo apt install Compton and nitrogen. Both packages are in the repository. And that installed just fine. Super shift C to close that Xterm. And now if I do a super Q to restart Xmonad, it should run Compton and nitrogen dash dash restore. So mod Q, super Q. And this is an error. So the great thing about Xmonad is if you do anything wrong, and I mean anything, bad spacing, you know, adding a comma or something where you shouldn't have, or in my case, using spawn once when that variable is not in scope. So anytime you get something like that, variable not in scope, it means, hey, we are using this command spawn once, but we didn't import any module that, you know, actually has anything to do with spawn once. So if I do GG to get back to the top of this document, here in the imports, we need to do an import, and we need to find the library that we need to import. I'm not sure what it is off the top of my head. We may just have to do a super P and open Firefox. I'm going to do a search for Xmonad spawn once. And you see right here, it's in the Haskell documentation. And by the way, the Xmonad documentation is basically haskell.org. And you see, spawn once is found in this library, xmonad.util.spawnOnce. All I need to do then is import space, and then let me copy that over, xmonad.util.spawnOnce. Let me write that, and then super Q to restart, and Xmonad started just fine. So we fixed the error. So, you know, that was not that hard. And, you know, this is not something I do that often. I mean, most of my Xmonad config was written years and years ago. But when you get an error, it tells you what the error is. And if you just do a simple search in Google or DuckDuckGo for what you're looking for, Haskell has great documentation. You're going to find exactly what you need to do in the documentation. You just have to read the documentation. So let me do a super P, and I'm going to run nitrogen, because nitrogen dash dash restore won't actually work until we actually have it set a wallpaper, at least for the very first time. So I'm going to go into preferences, and we need to set a directory for it to look for wallpaper. I'm not exactly sure where the default wallpapers are in Ubuntu. On most systems, they're going to be in user share background. So that's the first place I'm going to look. I'm going to go into the file system and then in user share backgrounds. Yeah, and I'm going to select that directory. I'm going to hit OK. Yeah, and that's the default wallpapers here in Ubuntu. I'll just select the default one and I'll hit apply. Then Super Shift C to close nitrogen. I'm actually going to close the config too while we're at it, just so we can see our wallpaper. There's our wallpaper. Let me Super Shift Enter to open up Xterm again. Xterm is very, very small as far as the font. I really need to fix that. Why don't we install a better terminal? Actually, why don't we just close that? And I'm going to Super P again, and let's open up the GNOME terminal. Let's just use the GNOME terminal for now. So I'm going to get back into the config. Oh, that's not the config, because I didn't type the full path. .xmonad/xmonad.hs. And let's go down to that my terminal variable. And for now, let's just set that back to GNOME-terminal. Right and quit. Then I'm going to Super Shift C to close that. I'm going to Super P to get D menu. Let's open nitrogen again. Let's make this scaled. Hit apply. Super Shift C to close nitrogen. Alright, we need to get a proper screen resolution. This is something really just for the VM here that I need to do. Super Shift C to open a terminal. Still not the right terminal because we haven't restarted Xmonad. I changed the config and wrote it, but you have to restart Xmonad, which is Super Q. And now Super Shift Enter should open the GNOME terminal. I hope that made sense. I'm going to run a quick xrender here just so I can get a better screen resolution. I'm going to set xrender to 1920 by 1080 just so we get a full screen resolution now. And now let me Super Q to restart Xmonad so it redraws the wallpaper hopefully correctly for us. It didn't though. It kept the same one. Let me Super P. You just get nitrogen open here and hit apply. Super Shift C. Okay, we just reapplied the wallpaper. Alright, so at least we have wallpaper set. Now, we also have transparency set too. If you had anything transparent, you know, because Compton's taking care of that. We need a bar. So let me Super Shift Enter here. I'm going to sudo apt install, and the terminal most people are going to want to use with Xmonad is Xmobar. It's a panel written in Haskell, and it's designed to be used with Xmonad. You can use any panel, I mean technically with Xmonad, that's why it doesn't ship with a panel by default, but most of them won't play nice with Xmonad, unfortunately. And Xmobar works great with Xmonad. Xmobar is actually fantastic. It may not be as flashy and have all the whiz-bang bling as some other bars out there, but if you're going to use Xmonad, I strongly recommend at least start with Xmobar because it's going to have all the information you want. It's going to have all the workspace names, and it's going to tell you exactly which monitors have stuff open on them. If you have a multi-monitor system, it's going to give you the name of the layout, how many windows are, you know, all the information you could want. Where if you install something like Polybar, you're not going to get some of that information. You're going to be limited in what Polybar shows you in Xmonad. So let's go ahead and give it a password. Really, there's only 2 characters in my password, and I mistyped it. Alright, I'm going to Super Shift C to close that window. Now to use Xmobar, we need to get an Xmobar config. So let me Super Shift Enter to get my terminal. And I believe I've done this enough now. I think it's Control Shift Plus to zoom in the GNOME terminal. Okay. And let's run the following command. Sudo find on root -i name for insensitive name searching Xmobar. So find any file or directory that has Xmobar as part of its name. Alright, and user share doc Xmobar looks like the folder we probably want because it's documentation, right? That's probably where we would find an example config. So let's cd into user share doc Xmobar. If I do an ls, in that directory, there is a directory called examples. So I'm pretty sure we're on the right track here. So let's cd into examples and do an ls xmobar.config. Okay, I like that. Now, we need to put that config somewhere else. I mean, I guess it could stay here, but I would rather it be in our home directory in .config. Let's copy xmobar.config over to our home directory and our .config directory, and it needs to be in its own directory called Xmobar. And then I'm going to name it. I could just name it xmobar.config, but I'll name it xmobar.rc for a more conventional naming. Cannot create the regular file, no such file or directory, so this directory doesn't exist. Home dt config xmobar. So let's do a mkdir for make directory and make the .config/xmobar directory. And now if I go back and copy xmobar.config over to that directory and rename it xmobar.rc, it works. And let me clear the screen. And I'm going to cd back into the home directory. Let's cd into .config/xmobar, do an ls, and you see xmobar.rc. So let's go ahead and open that up in Vim. This is the Xmobar config, the sample one. And let's not even play with it right now. What we really need is to make sure that Xmobar is launched when Xmonad is first launched. So what we really need to do is cd back into the home directory, cd back into .xmonad, and Vim xmonad.hs. So we need to go to the section in the config that is called main. So I'm going to page down a few times, and I think in the default config it's actually toward the bottom. Yeah, here it is. So right here, main equals xmonad space defaults. We're going to edit this so that it launches Xmobar every time Xmonad is launched. So I'm not a Haskell programmer by trade, so this is not the only way to do this. This is just the way that I've always done it over my years of running Xmonad. Let me get into insert mode. I'm going to do main equals do space, and then I'm going to space one more time. I'm going to indent this over 2 spaces, and in this line I'm going to indent over 2 spaces, and I'm going to do xmproc, then less than, then a dash, and then this command spawn pipe space, and then quotes, and then we need to run the xmobar command. So xmobar space, and then I usually give it this flag here, -x, for which x display 0, meaning launch Xmobar on monitor 1. Now this is important if you were launching multiple instances of Xmobar, which I do because I have a 3-monitor system. You guys that are only on 1 monitor, you really don't need to fool with this, but it's important to know. That's why I'm going to show it in this video, because I know a lot of you guys do run multi-monitors, and this is how you specify which monitor which Xmobar goes on. Then we need to write the path to the Xmobar config, which in my case was /home/dt/.config/xmobar/xmobar.rc. And then in the quotes there, get back into normal mode. Now if I write this and then super Q to restart Xmonad, it's going to give me an error. It didn't like that command that I just added, that xmproc spawn pipe xmobar command, and it actually tells me it doesn't like spawn pipe. Why does it not like spawn pipe? Well, the variable is not in scope. Remember that from earlier? So it's the same kind of deal. We probably need to open up a web browser, go to the Haskell documentation, and figure out what library has spawn pipe. I already know which one has it though. I just happen to know that one. So we're going to go to the one we added earlier, import xmonad.util.spawn_once. I'm going to copy that, because we need to import xmonad.util.run. Hit escape, :W to write, and then super Q to restart Xmonad, and it restarted just fine, no errors. Xmobar is running too. You just can't see it because the terminal is hiding it, but if I do super 2 to go to the second workspace, you will see we now have a bar with extremely small font, but this is the sample Xmobar running here. A super 1 to get back to the first workspace. Now, why is the bar hidden when other windows are open? That's just the default behavior, but you can change that. Let's see if we can figure out how to change that. So I'm going to do super P on the keyboard, and let's go ahead and launch Firefox. Now this may be a little complicated, but you guys need to see this kind of stuff, because again, this is not, I don't do this kind of hacking on my window managers that often, because I've had my configs set for a long time. So even though I've done all of this in Xmonad before, it's not like it's something that I've done, you know, last week, last month, even something in the last year or two. So this is, but I know I'm going to figure out how to do this. So let's figure out how we get our panels or docks or whatever in Xmonad not to be covered up by the windows. Well, let's just do a search for Xmonad manage docks, because I already know that that's the utility. You guys may have to search for some different search terms, but for me, I actually do know the library that we're looking for. I'm going to click on it, and Xmonad.hooks.manage docks. So you already know we're probably going to have to import that. We read the description. It says this module provides tools to automatically manage dock type programs such as the GNOME panel, Kicker, DZen, and Xmobar. So there you go. Since we already know we're going to have to import that, I'm going to go ahead and import it over here. Let's try to keep everything kind of in alphabetical order over here. I'll just put it right there, see if I can copy it, escape. And then it says once we import that module, we need to wrap our Xmonad config with a call to docs like so. Main equals Xmonad, and then $symbol docs default. Remember we had Xmonad default in the main. Now we need Xmonad $symbol docs default. So let me hit capital G to go to the end of this document here in Vim, but it looks like we went a little too far, but I know the main was somewhere down toward the bottom of the document. All right, so there is my main equals, and then we added do, and then the xmproc xmobar, but there's Xmonad defaults. And if the documentation is correct, we should add a $symbol docs space and then defaults. Let me write. And I have no idea if this is going to work, but I'm just showing you guys the process that I go about this, right? I had a problem, I did a search, I went into the Haskell documentation, and the documentation looks good. Like it really does. It looks really good. Let's go ahead and super Q to restart Xmonad. Okay, we didn't get any errors, so that's good, but we still don't see Xmobar. So that's not good. I mean, Xmobar is still running, but it's still covered up by our windows here. Let me switch to a different workspace. I'm going to super shift enter just to make sure it's the case on every workspace it is. So super 1 to get back to the first workspace. I didn't read the documentation well enough, though. I read the first 2 lines, but it says then we need to add avoid struts or avoid struts on as a layout modifier to our layouts to avoid windows from overlapping our docks or our panels. So I need to add in the layout hook avoid struts, that term right there. So let me scroll up here and find the layout hook. All right, it's not named layout hook, it's called my layout, but you see my layout equals tiled, mirrored, tiled, full. Kind of like here, right? Except now they are saying we need to add avoid struts. So I'm going to add avoid struts space and then wrap the rest of it in parentheses. So tiled, mirror tiled, and full we wrap in parentheses. Let me escape, W to write. And let's do a super Q to see if Xmonad restarts correctly. Ha! We didn't get any errors, and did you see the windows move a little bit? Now we have Xmobar running at the top of the screen. So again, I'm just showing you guys the process, right? It's not about me showing you every little detail here. There's a process to this. You have something, you want to figure it out, you go to the documentation. And the documentation told me exactly what to do. Now, I get it. If you've never done this kind of stuff, it's confusing, especially if you've never done any kind of programming or scripting. But when you see me do it in action, it's not complicated, right? And Xmonad, honestly, is one of the more complicated ones because of the fact it's written in such a strange language that not too many people know Haskell, but you don't really need to know any Haskell. I don't know any Haskell, but I can read the documentation well enough to know what I need to put in that config. Now, let me get back into the VM here. I'm going to close out Firefox here. The only thing I want to do on this video, because I've been rambling on for a little bit here, is we've done pretty good with our Xmonad config here, but now that we've got Xmobar running, I know some of you guys are not going to like that small font and the colors and everything. Let me show you a little bit of how Xmobar works. I'm going to cd into .config Xmobar, do an ls, and then I'm going to vim Xmobar rc. Let me show you how this config works. So the first thing you're going to want to do is you're going to want to change the font. Now you can write the fonts in this weird layout here. That's kind of the old school standard way of writing your fonts. Most people are not going to know how to do that without using a tool, like one of the X font tools or something, to figure out exactly how to write your fonts, but it accepts normal font names. And how you do it is you do XFT : and then name of the font. It has to be a font, of course, on your system. On Ubuntu, I know the Ubuntu font family is installed by default, and Ubuntu Mono is a really good mono-spaced font. That's the one that we're actually looking at in this terminal. So that's the one I'm going to put in Xmobar for purposes of this video. I'm going to do Ubuntu space mono and then colon, and then pixel size equals, and let's set the size to 12. I think that's a big enough size. You guys can actually read it. And right now, that font size that it's showing is a very small font size. If you wanted to, you could do colon anti-alias equals true to set some anti-aliasing. You could also do colon and then hinting equals true to set some hinting. And if I do a colon W and write that, and then do super Q to restart Xmonad, which of course will restart Xmobar. Alright, the font size still is very small. I don't know, maybe we should change it quite a bit. Let's do 16 font. Colon W to write, and then super Q to restart Xmonad. You know what, let me super shift enter to get a new terminal up. Let me kill all Xmobar, and then super Q to restart Xmonad just to make sure. Okay, yeah. I think the problem was we still had the old Xmobars still on the screen and we were creating new ones. Yeah, so I like that. That's looking okay there. Now if you wanted to, you could change the background. The background color is set to black by default, but you can set it to anything you want. It accepts standard hex values. You can change the position of Xmobar if you wanted to. You see position equals top. You could change that to bottom. We should talk about the widgets that appear in the bar here. These widgets, you see commands equal, and then weather, network, CPU, memory, swap, com, which is any shell command. In this case, they're running a uname with the S and R flags. And then date, which is the time and date in this particular format. And at the very bottom, it says template equals, and that is the order that all of this in the commands section is actually outputted in the bar. So that was just a very introductory look at Xmonad. Now, if you guys want to see a more complete Xmonad config that's taken me a number of years to kind of get working the way I want it to work, here is my current Xmonad config with my Xmobar. If I open up my Xmonad config, you will see a little bit of what's going on here. And let me zoom in a little bit so you can see my config. And in the default config, there were only about 3 libraries imported, and we ended up importing 2 or 3 extras along the way. You can see in mine, I've got a lot of imports. Unfortunately, you do have to import a bunch of extra modules to do some of what you want to do with your window manager, but that's fine. Like I said, you can really tailor Xmonad to be exactly the way you want it to do what you want it to do. You can see in my config, I set some variables here. I set the default font, I set my mod key to the super key, my terminal to Alacrity, my text editor to NeoVim, the border width around the windows to 2 pixels. This next variable, window count equals, and then this long line here, I believe this is the window count. It tells me the number of windows that are open on the screen. You see 1 in Xmobar. Now in a tiling window manager, you're probably wondering why you need to know how many windows are open on the screen. Well, I guess if you were in a stacking mode where windows were stacked one on top of another, or a monocle mode, that could be useful. And you see in my main equals do, I have quite a bit of extra stuff in here. Mainly the stuff that's going to be interesting to you guys is, you see I have 3 different XM procs and spawn pipes Xmobar, because 3 different monitors, they're launching 3 different Xmobars with 3 different Xmobar configs. Now actually all 3 of these configs right now, if you go look at them on my .files repository and my GitLab, all 3 of these Xmobars are the exact same thing, but in the past I have actually used 3 different Xmobar configs so that each monitor had some different information in the bar. The next thing you guys might want to check out in my config is this section here, loghook equals dynamic loghook with pp, and then Xmobar pp, and then pp output, pp current, pp visible. These are settings for Xmobar. And this is the settings for stuff like the workspace colors, workspace, the layout names, and things like that. the separators between the modules here. If I scroll down my config, you will see most of my config is very similar to the default config. I mean, my startup hook equals do spawn once. I'm auto starting nitrogen, PyCom, Compton, the network manager applet, the volume icon applet, and trayer. And that's everything here in the right. Trayer is the system tray, and the applets that are auto launching are the network manager and the volume icon. I have it commented out currently because I've been using Vim, but I've used Emacs in the past, and if I wanted to, I could also spawn on Autostart the Emacs daemon. The next thing I have in my config, of course, is keybindings. Lots of keybindings. Then toward the bottom, you get into the workspaces. I have my workspaces here set to names instead of numbers, but the numbers still do work. I could super 1 through 9, and those correspond with the names in the Xmobar. I've also hacked it a little bit to be clickable, where I can actually click workspaces. So if I wanted to click on workspace 6 here, I can actually go to it. If I wanted to click back and go to maybe workspace 1, I could get back to workspace 1. Now, typically on a tiling window manager, you're not ever using the mouse, but I wanted that functionality in my Xmobar just because, right? I wanted to see if it was possible. It was possible. It took a little research to figure out how to do that, actually. You need a tool called XDoTool. Basically, what XDoTool does is it simulates what would have been a key binding, like Super 6 goes to that chat workspace. It allows, a mouse click to basically run that command instead. Going further into my config, my layouts, now by default, the default Xmonad config only had 3 layouts. I have 7 or 8 layouts in my Xmonad. I only use about 3 layouts. I typically use master and stack all the time, or monocle mode if I need to go full screen for something, or floating mode. Those are the only 3 layouts I ever use. So why do I have all these other layouts? Just to show you a little bit about what's possible in Xmonad. I've had all these layouts in my config for years, and I've had them on my, at first, GitHub, and now on my GitLab. So you guys can inspect them, and you might find some of these layouts that I don't use interesting. That's why I have them here. I also have scratch pads here. I did a video a while back on how to add a scratch pad in Xmonad. Check out that video if you are interested at all in the scratch pads. Now before I go, I want to thank a few special people. I want to thank the producers of this show: Michael, Mitchell, Gabe, Arch5530, Chris, Chuck, DJ, Donnie, Dylan, George, Haplo, Nate, LibreQuest, Omri, Paul, Rob, Sean, and Willie. These guys, they are the producers of the show. They are my highest tiered patrons over on Patreon. Without these guys, you wouldn't have got this episode about getting started with Xmonad. The show is also brought to you by all these fine ladies and gentlemen. All these names you're seeing on the screen right now, these are all my supporters over on Patreon, because this show is sponsored by you guys, the community. If you'd like to support my work, consider doing so. You'll find DistroTube over on Patreon. All right, guys. Peace.